Rain found every seam in Charlotte Johansson's mantle and slid down her spine in cold threads that made her bite the inside of her cheek to keep her teeth from chattering. The dawn mail coach had already pulled ahead from the posting yard at Warfield Cross, but she still walked behind it on the Bath Road because walking cost less than pleading for a seat she could not purchase. Mud clung to the hem of her dress. Her left shoe had split at the sole some time in the night, and each step pressed wet grit against skin already rubbed open. By the second mile her heel had begun to bleed into her stocking. She felt it in pulses, warm and small, the only warmth she had. Men at the yard had watched her go in the grey hour before sunrise, hats tipped back, faces expressionless in the way of people who wanted no part in another family's disgrace. A woman with a baby had shifted her basket farther from Charlotte's carpet bag when she sat on the bench. 2 ostlers had looked at her hands, and then at the bag, and then away, the sequence brisk and practised. Dismissed girl, stolen something, turned out before light. The story wrote itself for strangers who had no reason to imagine a kinder one. Charlotte had stood to one side of the yard pump and hauled water for the stable boy while he cursed the broken latch on the tack room, because he had asked and because labour was still a language she knew how to speak. No one thanked her. No one asked her name. Her fingers were raw from the pump handle and from last night's hauling besides. Lady Halwick had ordered 2 trunks moved from the Blue Room to the carriage house after supper, and Charlotte had carried what she could alone when the footman pretended not to hear. Silk gowns that were not hers, velvet cloaks that smelled of rosewater and cedar, a jewel casket too heavy for one person, lined in green satin with a silver clasp shaped like a swan. Lady Halwick had watched from the doorway, one hand on the jamb, violet silk whispering at her ankles, and said with that bright social smile she reserved for injury, "You are fortunate I allow you until morning. Some burdens are put out at once." There had been guests in the drawing-room, 2 neighbouring ladies, a clergyman's wife, one young gentleman with polished boots and the look of a man pretending not to witness cruelty because he hoped to marry into it. Charlotte had bowed her head because defiance in front of company only made punishment inventive. Now, on the road, she could still feel the half-burned paper in the pocket sewn inside her bag, brittle at the singed edge where flame had eaten the signature clean through. Lady Halwick had pressed it into her hand beside the fire, the parchment warm from the grate, and said, "One night, Miss Johansson. By morning you are off my property." My property, not your father's house, not Halwick House as it had stood before the second marriage and the inventory books and the little sales that became larger ones. My property. The word had settled in Charlotte's stomach like a stone she could not digest. Hunger had made her light-headed by dawn. There had been no breakfast set for her in the servants' hall. Mrs. Pike, the cook, had looked at her with wet eyes, and then toward the corridor, fearful of being seen. Charlotte had smiled, as if it did not matter. She had taken nothing from the kitchen, though she might have tucked a heel of bread into her sleeve, and no one would have blamed her except the woman who kept accounts of every crumb when that crumb belonged to Charlotte. Pride was a poor meal. She carried it anyway. At 22, she was old enough to understand the exact mechanics of ruin. It had not arrived in one blow. It had arrived in columns of figures, in signatures made under candlelight after midnight, in a shipping loss at Gothenburg that took half her father's fleet and all his certainty. Captain Johan Johansson had come home with salt still in his coat, and his eyes bloodshot from weeks without proper sleep, and he had sat Charlotte at the library table, and said they would recover. He had believed numbers could be straightened if one looked at them long enough. He had believed men honoured guarantor bonds. He had believed illness was a temporary inconvenience. Then fever took him in January. Her mother followed him before the next winter passed, lungs too weak, grief too heavy, and the house that had once rung with 2 languages and argument over maps became a place of closed doors and instructions delivered through other people's mouths. Lady Halwick had entered as a solution and remained as a system. She sold the silver first, claiming economy, then 2 portraits from the long gallery, saying dust ruined old oils, and no one would miss them. She dismissed the tutor and said Charlotte no longer required books at her age. She locked the library and kept the key on a ribbon at her waist. She transferred the better rooms to her daughters and moved Charlotte to the narrow attic over the east wing where the wind pushed through the casement. She called Charlotte plain when others were listening, and then called her ungrateful when no one was near. Yet plain was never the right word. Charlotte's face was too clear in line for that, her mouth too expressive when she forgot to guard it, her eyes too large and grey and watchful, beneath dark lashes that looked almost black against skin gone pale from missed meals and cold corridors. Cruelty required her to be invisible. She was not. That was part of the offence. The road dipped and water pooled in ruts deep enough to hide stone. Charlotte stepped wrong and hissed through her teeth as her heel struck hard. She stopped beside a mile marker half swallowed by moss and set the carpet bag down. Her hand shook when she unlaced the ruined shoe. The stocking at the back had reddened through. Not much. Enough. She tore a strip from the inner lining of her petticoat with careful fingers and wrapped it tight around the cut, then pulled the shoe back on and stood slowly until the dizziness passed. Carriages rolled by without slowing. One gentleman looked directly at her and then at her bare, muddy ankle where the skirt had lifted, and his gaze held not concern but calculation, as if placing her station were an arithmetic exercise. Governess dismissed, companion discharged, fallen relation. It did not matter. She kept walking. By mid-morning the rain softened to a fine mist that clung to lashes and made distances uncertain. The coach she had followed vanished over the hill, and with it the small comfort of other wheels on the same road. Hedgerows narrowed the way. Wet hawthorn brushed her sleeve. She counted steps in sets of 100 to keep her mind from circling the drawing-room scene again. The clergyman's wife had looked away when Lady Halwick accused Charlotte of disloyalty. The young gentleman had examined his gloves. One of the neighbouring ladies had actually laughed when Lady Halwick said, "She imagines this house was ever hers." Laughed, then sipped tea from a cup Charlotte had washed that afternoon. The bag at her side grew heavier with each mile, though it held little enough: 1 spare chemise, stockings mended twice at the toe, a comb with 3 teeth missing, a thin volume of Cowper wrapped in cloth, and the ledger. Her father's ledger was bound in cracked brown leather and swollen at the spine from damp. He had kept entries in Swedish and English both, columns neat, ship names underlined, payment dates marked with small crosses. Charlotte had copied invoices into the margins in her narrow, disciplined hand, first to help him when his eyes tired, later to understand what frightened him. In the last 6 months before his death, she had begun to notice alterations. Numbers thickened by fresh ink. A 2 turned to a 7. A paid notation scratched faintly and overwritten. She had marked discrepancies with tiny dots near the gutter where only she would think to look. She had said nothing while her father coughed blood into a linen square and told her to trust the papers. After he died, Lady Halwick asked for all account books. Charlotte gave her 3 and hid 1. The guilt of that concealment had burned for weeks. Then Lady Halwick tried to sell the orchard on debt grounds, and Charlotte understood guilt could be useful when it kept evidence alive. At a fork, where one lane bent toward Bristol and the other toward Bath, she chose Bath because the name promised inns large enough to swallow one more disgraced woman without comment. Her coin purse held 4 shillings and a bent farthing, not enough for proper lodging for more than 2 nights, enough for a pallet in a common room if she spoke little and paid in advance. She imagined the smell before she reached it. Smoke sunk into beams, spilled ale, damp wool steaming near a fire. She imagined men who would ask no questions if she kept her eyes down. She imagined locking her bag beneath her knees while she slept. Shortly after noon, she saw the signboard through rain, a painted stag faded by weather, hanging askew above a yard churned to mud. The White Hart Inn. Carts stood in a line near the stables. 2 post boys argued over harness straps. A maid emptied ash from a scuttle by the kitchen door and paused when she saw Charlotte, taking in the torn hem, the cracked shoe, the mantle dark with rain. No pity, no contempt, only recognition of labour in another body. Charlotte nodded. The maid nodded back and went inside. Charlotte did not go in at once. She stepped under the narrow shelter of the eaves and set her carpet-bag down by the wall, where rain could not reach it. Her shoulders ached from the strap. Her stomach cramped again, hard and hollow. She pressed her palm flat against the leather top, feeling through the damp the shape of the ledger's spine. Still there, still dry enough, still hers to carry. In the yard, a groom shouted at a chestnut horse that refused the mounting block. Somewhere beyond the stable wall, iron struck iron in a steady rhythm. The ordinary sounds of people with work and place and meals waiting at day's end. Charlotte straightened her back, wiped rain from her face with the heel of her hand, and lifted the bag again before anyone could ask her whether she belonged. She crossed the threshold of the White Hart, with her head high and her skirt dripping onto rushes already dark with old weather, and the warmth that met her was not comfort but assault, thick with mutton fat, wet wool, yeast, smoke, and the sweet rot of apples gone soft in a basket near the settle. A dozen faces turned in one motion. Travellers measured her mantle, her frayed cuffs, the carpet-bag clutched too tightly, and then performed the small social cruelty of returning to their cups as if she had ceased to exist. The innkeeper stood behind a scarred oak counter with a ring of keys at her waist and a slate in her hand, broad-shouldered, practical, not unkind, but trained by years to distrust hunger when it came dressed as gentility. "You need a room?" she asked. Charlotte placed her 4 shillings and bent farthing on the counter 1 coin at a time so neither hand nor voice would betray the tremor in her body. "A pallet in the common room, if you please. 1 night, paid now." The woman counted, pushed the bent coin back with 1 finger, and said, "That buys a pallet and broth. Bread, if there is any left after the carriers." Charlotte nodded once. "Thank you." She might once have corrected the arithmetic, might once have said that in her father's ledger this same sum had purchased decency and change besides, but the lesson of the last 2 years had been plain. Injustice argued with power became punishment. Injustice paid quietly became shelter. A stableman brushed past her shoulder as if she were furniture, and called toward the kitchen for ale. A gentleman in travel black watched her from near the hearth with the detached interest men kept for women travelling alone. 2 seamstresses by the window took in the blood seeping faintly at the heel of her stocking, and then looked quickly at each other, not cruel, only fearful of recognition. The maid from the yard appeared with a chipped bowl and set it before Charlotte at the end of the long table where smoke from the fire reached last. "Eat while it is hot," she murmured, and Charlotte, who had not heard gentleness all day, nearly failed to answer. She forced her throat open. "I am obliged." By the time the church bell in the lane struck 1, she had swallowed thin broth that tasted mostly of salt and onion skin, and each spoonful made her body remember hunger in sharper detail, as if relief had woken pain rather than eased it. She sat with her bag wedged between her boots and her knees braced around it, guarding it even while she ate, and the posture pulled memory through her like wire. There had been another table once. Walnut polished each Michaelmas. Her father at the head with sea charts rolled beside the carving knife. Her mother correcting his Swedish with laughing severity, while candlelight caught in her dark hair. Charlotte at 16 translating invoice terms aloud, proud of speed, proud of being useful. Then fever season. Then letters from Gothenburg with blurred seals. Then Captain Johan Johansson standing in that same room with one hand pressed hard against the edge of the chair because the cough would not stop, saying in a voice already thinned by illness, "The guarantor bond from Ravensmere stands. We will bridge this quarter and settle after spring convoy." He had still believed signatures meant honour. He had still believed men of rank feared God enough to keep numbers clean. She had believed him because daughters did. When he died, she was 20 and old in 1 week. When the morning crepe was still pinned to the mirrors, Lady Halwick took over household accounts on the argument of necessity. Charlotte remembered the first morning her stepmother entered the breakfast room in dove-grey silk and said, "You will leave financial matters to me now. You are emotional. You mistake sentiment for management." She remembered the second week when silver serving pieces vanished from the sideboard and Lady Halwick called it prudent consolidation. She remembered the first locked door, the key on violet ribbon, and her own hand on the library latch that no longer opened, though every book inside had once answered to her father's voice and then to hers. The broth cooled. She ate it anyway, each spoonful accompanied by a scene she had spent months trying not to revisit. Lady Halwick had not been theatrical in private. That was the efficient horror of her. She practised the banal injury that left no clean bruise for witnesses to denounce. She reassigned Charlotte's maid and said grown women dressed themselves. She cut candles to half length in the attic room and called it economy, while her daughters burned 3 each in their dressing chamber to flatter complexion before dinner. She moved Charlotte from her mother's old room with its south light and chest of winter quilts to the narrow garret above the east wing, where frost filmed the inside glass by November and rain tapped through cracked putty into the wash basin. She inventoried gowns and wrote Charlotte's name beside none. "These pieces are to remain in family circulation," she said, which meant Arabella and Minerva Halwick could choose first and second, while Charlotte mended what they discarded. Arabella took the blue walking dress Charlotte had stitched with her mother in the spring before the fever. Minerva took her kid gloves, then laughed that Charlotte's hands were too rough for kid leather anyway. The laugh had been soft, almost musical, and all the worse for it. At supper they spoke over her as if she were paid staff, and soon paid staff treated her as competition for scraps of authority neither of them had. Charlotte carried coal scuttles, copied invitations, polished brass, read aloud to Lady Halwick when her head ached, and then was told she had done each task poorly enough to justify correction. Corrections came as withheld meals, as impossible lists, as public remarks placed with precision where neighbours could hear. Poor Charlotte has no talent for society. Poor Charlotte was always awkward. Poor Charlotte has such a strange foreign surname, people do not know what to do with her. The name itself became an offence in those rooms. Johansson sounded like trade, like salt, like ships and labour and men who counted freight, not bloodlines. She carried it anyway because her father had once lifted her onto his desk, touched the ledger with ink-stained fingers and said, "Numbers are a language, Lottie. If someone lies in one language, check the other." She had checked. Quietly at first, then with urgency when the entries grew swollen with fresh ink and impossible timing. A debt paid in March appeared unpaid in June. A warehouse fee doubled without corresponding receipt. A guarantor mark copied, then thickened. She had confronted Lady Halwick once, only once, in the small morning room, when rain made the windows opaque and the household had not yet risen. She placed 2 pages side by side and said very carefully, "These amounts do not reconcile." Lady Halwick did not even look at the paper. She looked at Charlotte's face and smiled. "Your father indulged this numerical hobby because he had no son. Do not mistake indulgence for authority." When Charlotte did not move, Lady Halwick took the pages, fed them to the grate one corner at a time, and watched until ash collapsed. There! Reconciled! That had been the morning Charlotte began hiding records in seams, beneath loose boards, inside old atlas cases in the locked library she could still enter, because she had never surrendered one key her father forgot he gave her. She had expected fear then. She discovered something else. Anger, yes, but cleaner than fear. Anger that kept her spine straight while she scrubbed steps with cracked hands. Anger that made memory exact, dates, sums, witnesses, ink colour, pressure of pen strokes. She was weary, hungry, displaced, and publicly shamed, but she was not uncertain. She finished the broth, wiped the bowl clean with the heel of the bread she had been allotted, and stood when the innkeeper called for payment entry. At the counter a ledger lay open with names and destinations, blunt, practical script that decided where a body might sleep. The innkeeper dipped her quill and asked, "Name?" "Charlotte Johansson." A brief pause. The woman's eyes lifted to Charlotte's face, then down to the handwriting, as if testing whether this rain-soaked figure could truly produce such disciplined letters. Charlotte wrote anyway, each character upright despite numb fingers. "Origin, Halwick House." The quill stilled. A drover waiting to sign after her shifted his weight and listened without disguise. "Employment?" the innkeeper asked, voice flattening into formality that protected both of them. Charlotte could have said companion, could have said governess, could have lied toward respectability. She heard Lady Halwick's drawing-room tone in her ear, burdens spoken like stain. She thought of Arabella wearing her mother's cameo at breakfast, chain too long, as if grief were ornament. She thought of Minerva sending her down 2 flights for pins already in the workbox simply to prove she could. She thought of the half-burned expulsion note warm from the fire and the guests pretending not to see. "Displaced relation," she said at last, because truth in that room would wound less than invention discovered later. The innkeeper made no comment. She took the line as given and drew a mark beside it that meant paid. "Pallet by the west wall. Keep your bag under you. Cart has come in late." Charlotte inclined her head. "I understand." She turned toward the common room, then stopped and reached inside her mantle for the folded paper, the edge still singed. "There is one matter," she said softly. "If any messenger from Halwick House asks whether I lodged here, you may say yes. You may also say I left no papers behind." The innkeeper looked at the paper without reaching for it. "Are there papers to ask after?" Charlotte met her gaze. "Only what belongs to my father." The woman's mouth tightened, not in disbelief, but in recognition of a familiar war fought with receipts and signatures instead of swords. "Then keep them close." Charlotte returned to the table, sat where smoke hid her from the door, and opened her carpet bag only enough to slip her hand around the ledger's spine. The leather was damp at the corners, but sound. She checked the tucked packet of copied entries she had made during winter, each page folded into oilcloth from an old map case. Still dry, still legible. No external hand had touched them since dawn. She resealed the bag and placed both feet through the strap, anchoring herself to evidence as other women anchored themselves to dowry chests. Around her the inn moved through its rough afternoon rhythm, spoons against bowls, harness bells in the yard, a child laughing somewhere near the kitchen door, until a mother hushed him. Life continued with brutal indifference to private disaster. Charlotte sat in borrowed warmth and carried the full weight of how she had arrived there. Dead father, dead mother, a house renamed by theft, sisters perfumed in borrowed silk, and figures on a page that refused to lie even when people did. She did not weep. She lowered her head, pressed her palm once more to the bag at her feet, and waited for evening as if waiting itself were a task that could be done correctly. A crash split the afternoon like timber struck by lightning, followed at once by a horse's shrill panic and the heavy slam of wood against stone. The common room convulsed, benches scraped, tankards tipped. Someone near the door shouted for rope, another for a surgeon, and the words tangled with the violent rattle of harness chains in the yard. Charlotte was on her feet in one movement, the strap of her carpet bag still looped around both ankles from where she had anchored it under the table. It caught her, dragged, bit into her skin. She bent, tore free, seized the bag, and then dropped it again because the second sound came. A human cry cut short, then a body hitting cobbles with a force that travelled through the threshold and up her legs. Rain blew in through the open door in a grey sheet. Men crowded the entrance and blocked the light. She pushed between two broad coats, took an elbow in her ribs for the effort, and stepped into the yard where mud and wheel splinters lay scattered like broken ribs around an overturned travelling carriage. One wheel had shattered at the hub. Half the rim spun uselessly where it had landed. A lathered bay horse reared against twisted traces, while a postboy clung to the bridle, boots sliding in sludge. Beneath the carriage step, a young footman in Ravensmere black lay half on his side, face drained of colour, one arm trapped awkwardly under him. He was no child, only very young, perhaps 19, and the sight of his white knuckles and clenched jaw told Charlotte enough. Pain, shock, cold. People ringed him at a safe distance and talked over one another in the manner of those desperate to be seen helping while doing nothing useful at all. Then a rider came through the yard, gait at speed, rain streaming off a black greatcoat and the neck of a dark horse flecked with foam. He swung down before the animal had settled, boots striking stone with a sound that carried command even before he spoke. Tall, broad through shoulder and chest, dark hair plastered back by rain, face cut hard as if carved for judgment rather than mercy. A dark stain spread at his left sleeve near the cuff, not bright in the rain, but unmistakable against the cloth. He crossed the distance in 4 strides, and his voice hit the crowd like a thrown blade. "Move!" They moved. In men, carriers, stable hands. All of them at once. Charlotte was already kneeling in the mud by the fallen footman, fingers at his throat, counting pulse. Too rapid. She slipped her hand beneath his jaw to steady him as he tried to twist and rise. "Do not fight me," she said quietly. "You will worsen the arm." His breath came in short pulls. Rain ran down her neck into the collar of her dress. She looked around for linen. None. She caught the torn edge of her own chemise where it showed above the bodice seam, gripped and ripped a long strip free with both hands. The cloth gave with a harsh sound. She folded it, pressed it against the cut along the young man's forearm, and tied hard enough to slow the bleeding. A shadow fell over her. The rider had come to her shoulder. Up close he smelled of rain, horse, and iron. and the silence around him was stranger than shouting. People had stopped speaking simply because he was standing there. "She is not a surgeon," someone muttered from behind. The man did not turn. "If you wish to replace her, kneel." No one knelt. Charlotte kept her eyes on the injured footman's face. "Can you hear me?" The young man nodded once, jaw shaking. "Good. Keep your hand still. Breathe with me." She demonstrated slower and felt his breath begin to follow. The man above her crouched at last, coat dark with water, one gloved hand braced on the cobbles. His gaze passed over her hands, the torn chemise strip, the improvised knot, then to the footman's arm, where the angle was wrong. He spoke without looking away from the injury. "Can you set it?" "Yes, do it." The word was an order. The permission inside it was not small. Charlotte glanced at him then, briefly, and saw eyes the colour of winter water. No softness, no uncertainty. She had seen portraits of men like this in old galleries, men whose signatures moved grain, ships, and votes. She shifted closer to the footman's shoulder. "What is your name?" "Peter, miss." "Peter, look at me, not at your arm." She waited until his focus fixed on her face. "I will move it once. It will hurt. Then it will hurt less." He swallowed and managed, "Yes, miss." She positioned one hand above his wrist, one below the elbow, feeling for the break through soaked wool. Her own fingers trembled from cold. She tightened them until the tremor turned to pressure. She moved quickly and cleanly. Peter cried out once and then sagged, breathing hard but steadier. Charlotte tied a second strip of cloth around a splint improvised from snapped wheel slat, handed to her by the stable boy, without being asked. The crouching man watched every motion. By the time the church clock beyond the lane sounded the quarter hour, rain had begun to thicken again, flattening hair to Charlotte's temples and turning her skirt hem into a heavy rope against her calves. "Inside," the man said. Peter tried to speak. "Your Grace, I am—" "Inside," he repeated, this time to everyone. "Now." Two grooms lifted Peter carefully under Charlotte's instruction and carried him toward the inn kitchen, where heat and boiled water could be had. The crowd opened before them. The rider rose to full height and turned to Charlotte at last, as if the entire yard had been waiting for that pivot. She stood because remaining on her knees felt like surrender. Mud sucked at her split shoe. Her heel burned where the old cut had reopened. Rain slid from her hair down the line of her jaw. She became acutely aware of the torn chemise at her bodice and the way wet fabric had gone nearly transparent at her sleeves. Maximum vulnerability in a public yard, and this man seeing all of it with a gaze that did not avert itself out of politeness. "You are injured," he said. It was not a question. "I am functional." His eyes dropped to her left shoe, to the red blooming at the stocking seam, then rose again. "You are cold." She said nothing. "You will come inside?" The tone admitted no refusal. The words carried across rank, as if rank were not negotiable. She ought to have bristled. She did. And still she followed because Peter needed checking again, and because the rain was turning her hands numb enough to lose precision. The inn kitchen was heat and steam, and copper pots banging against hooks as startled maids made room. Peter lay on a scrubbed table with a folded blanket under his head, face damp and grey but conscious. Charlotte moved to him at once. "Boiling water, clean cloth, vinegar if you have it." The kitchen maid who had given her broth earlier darted away and obeyed. A cook with flour to her elbows surrendered her apron strips without protest. Charlotte worked as she had in fever seasons beside her father's bed, counting, sorting, binding. She cleaned the cut, tightened the splint, checked fingers for warmth and movement. Peter flinched, cursed softly, apologised, and tried not to faint. "You will keep him upright," Charlotte told one groom. "If he sleeps now, wake him every quarter hour for the next hour." The groom looked over her shoulder to the man in black for confirmation. The man said, "Do what she tells you." Only then did the groom nod and obey. The authority chain was clear in a single breath, and the room knew it. Charlotte knew it too. She had heard the name Ravensmere in whispers long before she ever saw the man who carried it. Widower. Estates across 3 counties. A household run like a campaign. Orders carried out before their echo faded. A duke who had buried his wife 3 years ago and had spoken less each year since. It was one matter to hear tales in servants' passages. It was another to feel the force of his presence close enough to smell rain on his coat and find that rumour had understated him. When Peter's breathing settled, Charlotte stepped back. Her hands were striped red where the cold had cracked the skin at her knuckles. She wiped them on a cloth, then stopped because the cloth belonged to someone else, and she had forgotten the old etiquette of taking as little space as possible. Heat from the range reached her at last. It made her shiver harder. The man had not moved far. He stood near the door, broad shoulders filling half the frame, water still dripping from his coat hem to the flagged floor. A footman entered behind him and held out a folded towel with both hands. The man ignored it. His gaze stayed on Charlotte's wrists, bruises half hidden under damp cuffs, yellowing at the edges, newer purple nearer the bone. "Who did that?" he asked. She pulled her sleeve down by reflex. "I struck a trunk latch." "Liar!" The word was quiet. It landed harder than shouting. Heat rose to her face despite the cold. The kitchen had gone still around them. Even the cook pretended sudden interest in a kettle while listening with her whole body. "I did not request inquiry, sir." "You requested nothing." His eyes narrowed a fraction. "You set my man's arm in a courtyard while bleeding through your shoe." So he had seen that too. Of course he had. He took one step closer, not threatening, not gentle, exact. "Name." Charlotte held his gaze because lowering it now would feel like confession. "Charlotte Johansson." A flicker, nearly imperceptible, crossed his expression at the surname. It vanished at once. "Johansson," he repeated as if testing memory against sound. "Yes, Your Grace." One of the carriers near the back inhaled sharply at the title spoken aloud, and the room shifted around it. Duke. Not rumour. Fact. He removed one glove slowly, revealing scarred knuckles and a crescent of old white tissue near the thumb, the hand of a man who had used fists and reins and sword hilt more than pen in recent years. He held that hand out, palm up. "Give me your hand." The request sounded like command again. Charlotte hesitated one beat, then placed her right hand in his, because refusing before servants and strangers could be read as insolence she could not afford. His fingers closed around hers, firm and cool despite the kitchen heat. He turned her hand, looked at the cracked skin, the ingrained mud in her nail beds. The raw web between thumb and forefinger where pump handles had done their work. "Raw," he said, "and swollen." She tried to pull back. His grip tightened a fraction, then released. "I am able to work," she said. "I did not ask if you were able. I said what I saw." The precision of it unsettled her more than anger would have. People often ignored visible suffering because acknowledgement created obligation. He named it like an entry in a ledger. Factual, non-negotiable. A maid appeared with a basin of hot water and paused between them, uncertain where to place it. The Duke took it himself and set it on the prep table beside Charlotte. "Hands in." She stared at him. "Your Grace, there are others to tend." "Hands in." She obeyed because the heat promised pain and relief together, and because his tone made argument feel like wasted breath. The water bit first, then softened. Needles of sensation climbed her fingers to her wrists. She shut her eyes briefly. When she opened them, he was still watching her, not with curiosity, not with pity, but with a kind of fierce attention she had not invited and did not understand. From the yard came the rattle of another carriage drawing in. Hooves struck stone. Voices rose. Through the kitchen door the innkeeper appeared, cheeks flushed from haste, apron damp with rain. She looked directly at Charlotte, then at the Duke, and said with careful formality, "Your Grace, there is a lady in violet silk in the yard demanding immediate entry. She says the young woman is her stepdaughter and has stolen household papers. She has asked for constables." The water around Charlotte's hands went suddenly cold, though steam still rose from it. The Duke did not take his eyes off her face. "Stay where you are," he said. Charlotte drew her wet hands from the basin and dried them on the nearest cloth, because obedience was safer than argument, while fear was climbing her throat. She could hear the yard door bang against the outer wall. She could hear Lady Halwick's voice before she saw her, bright and sharp and pitched for witnesses. "Do not tell me to wait. That girl belongs to my household." The Duke did not turn toward the sound. He lifted the towel that had been ignored before and held it out to Charlotte. "Dry your fingers properly," he said. "You will need them." It was a strange sentence. It presumed the next blow and gave her a tool for it. She took the towel and pressed each finger into the rough linen until circulation returned in painful pins. Peter made a low sound from the table. She moved to him at once and checked the bandage knot at his forearm, then the colour of his nails, then the steadiness of his breath. He watched her with frightened eyes, trying to be brave in front of his master. "Am I dismissed, miss?" he whispered. Shame and pain tangled together. She bent so only he could hear. "You are injured, not at fault. Hold to that." By the time the chapel bell in the lane struck the half-hour, Lady Halwick entered the kitchen with rain glittering on violet silk and lavender flooding the hot air until the broth and smoke seemed to retreat from it. Arabella followed in dove-grey, gloved and dry beneath a cloak held over her by a footman, her mouth already curved in that delicate, practised pity Charlotte had learned to fear more than open cruelty. Behind them came Constable Briggs, broad, damp, and uncomfortable in the way of a man who knew he had been hired into someone else's family war. Lady Halwick stopped 3 paces inside and let her gaze travel over Charlotte's torn bodice, seam, muddy skirt, and bare forearm, as if cataloguing damage to household goods. "There she is," she said to the constable, "and there, if she has not hidden it, are Captain Johansson's papers she removed from my desk." Charlotte kept one hand on Peter's blanket, so he would not try to rise. "I removed nothing from your desk." Lady Halwick's smile did not reach her eyes. "You removed documents from my house in the night. You left without permission. You have caused a scene in a public inn, and now attached yourself to strangers for shelter." The Duke stepped forward just enough to place himself on Charlotte's left without touching her. The movement was small. Its meaning was not. "She attached herself to a bleeding man in my employ," he said, "because no one else did." Lady Halwick finally looked at him fully. Recognition struck in stages. First annoyance, then calculation, then a careful dip of her head. "Your Grace, had I known—" "You did not ask before accusing." Constable Briggs cleared his throat. "My Lord Duke, I was informed there was theft of account papers and possible assault within the household at Halewick House. I am required to inquire." Charlotte felt Peter tense beneath her fingers. He had heard the word assault. So had every servant in the kitchen. Lies spread fastest when wrapped in legal language. She stood straight, though her heel throbbed where blood had soaked anew through stocking and shoe. "Constable, if you must inquire, do so, but this man cannot be moved yet." She indicated Peter. "His arm was set less than half an hour ago. If he is jostled now, the bone may slip." Lady Halwick gave a soft laugh. "How moving! Charlotte has become a surgeon." Charlotte did not look at her. "I have become useful where I am allowed." Arabella's eyes narrowed at the tone. "Mamma, she is insolent." "Be silent," Lady Halwick murmured, still watching Charlotte. "Insolence is often confession in plain dress." The constable shifted his cap in his hands, caught between title and urgency. "Miss Johansson, will you surrender any papers you carry for inspection?" Charlotte could feel the strap mark at her ankles, where the carpet bag had bitten earlier, could feel the weight of the ledger as if it was still tied to her body. If she handed it to Lady Halwick here, it would vanish by evening. If she denied having it, the constable could search her and the bag in this room before all these eyes. Either way, humiliation would be public. She had become practised in enduring that. What mattered was where the papers were read. "I will surrender one ledger," she said, voice level. "To you, not to Lady Halwick. And only if you record that it belonged to Captain Johann Johansson and was in my lawful keeping as his daughter." Lady Halwick snapped for the first time, dropping polish. "Lawful keeping! You own nothing. Your father died in debt. I paid those debts to preserve your name." Charlotte turned then, and the quiet in the kitchen deepened, because everyone heard the edge she usually swallowed. "You paid selected debts with money from sold portraits and falsified balances. Preserve is not the word." Arabella took one step forward, colour rising. "How dare you?" "How dare she what?" the Duke asked, without raising his voice. Arabella stopped as if checked by a wall. By. Lady Halwick's nostrils flared, but she recovered quickly and looked to the constable again. "You hear her slander. She has always been unstable with figures. Her poor father indulged it, and now she mistakes columns for proof." At that, Charlotte saw Peter's eyes move from face to face, panic sharpening. He was new to this kind of room combat, where rank turned fact into theatre. His breathing began to shorten again. She set her palm to his shoulder. "Look at me," she said softly. "Not at them." He obeyed with effort. "Breathe to 4. She counted with him under her breath, then asked the kitchen maid for clean strips, and had her hold Peter's elbow while she retied the support knot. The maid's hands shook. Charlotte steadied them with a glance and a quiet, "There, firm, not tight." The maid nodded and did exactly as told. No one ordered her to stop. No one interrupted. Even Lady Halwick paused, as if uncertain whether dragging Charlotte away from an injured servant in front of a duke might cost more than it gained. When the bandage was secure, Charlotte wiped her hands again and addressed Constable Briggs. "My bag is in the common room by the west wall. I request that you fetch it yourself and open it in view of witnesses. Let the innkeeper stand by. Let your Grace stand by. Let Lady Halwick stand by. Then there will be no further claims of planting or concealment." The constable blinked. He had expected tears or denial. He had not expected procedure. "That is reasonable," he said at last. Lady Halwick stepped toward him, silk whispering with each controlled breath. "Constable, you are not here to indulge theatrics. Seize the bag and bring it to my carriage." "No," Charlotte said. The single word came out harder than she intended. She did not retract it. Lady Halwick's eyes flashed. "You will not command officers in my presence." Charlotte held her gaze now because it had gone too far for lowered eyes. "If the bag leaves this inn without inventory, papers can be removed and replaced. You know that. I know that. Constable Briggs knows that now. The constable flushed. Madam, the young woman is correct on process. Lady Hailwick made a small sound of disgust and turned to the Duke with a plea dressed as grace. Your Grace, this household dispute is beneath your concern. Kindly allow the law to proceed. I am allowing it, he said. Proceed, Constable. Briggs went out at once, grateful for plain instruction. The kitchen door swung shut behind him, leaving rain noise and a taut silence. Arabella moved nearer her mother and watched Charlotte with bright dislike, as if seeing for the first time not a drudge but a threat shaped like one. Lady Hailwick lowered her voice, each word honed. You are destroying yourself, Charlotte. Give me the book privately, and I may still place you, with a respectable family, in service. Charlotte almost smiled at the precision of the offer. Bribe wrapped in rescue offered before witnesses, who could later be told she had been generous. Her father had taught her to recognize false economy in numbers. The same pattern lived in speech. I am already in service, Charlotte said. To facts. The Duke's mouth changed by the smallest measure, not quite a smile. It vanished before it settled. Constable Briggs returned carrying the carpet-bag by its worn handle, the innkeeper at his shoulder exactly as requested. Mud marked the bag's lower seam, where it had sat by Charlotte's boots. Briggs placed it on the prep table and looked around the room as if counting who might later deny what happened. Witnesses present, he said stiffly. Opened now. Charlotte did not touch the latch. You may open it. He did. Awkward with damp fingers, the contents were plain and poor. Spare chemise, mended stockings, comb, thin book, oilcloth packet, ledger, nothing else, no jewels, no silver, no hidden purse. Arabella made a derisive sound at the sight of such meagre possessions. Lady Hailwick did not look at the clothes. She looked only at the ledger, and Charlotte saw hunger there as clear as hunger in a starving man's face. There, Lady Hailwick said sharply, my late husband's account book. Captain Johansson's, Charlotte corrected. Constable Briggs lifted it out. Water had darkened the cover edges but left the spine sound. Is this the item in dispute? It is one of them, Lady Hailwick said quickly. There are letters too. Bonds. In the packet, Charlotte said. Copies, not originals. In my hand. Briggs untied the oilcloth and unfolded the pages with care he had not shown before. Ink lines, dates, side-by-side entries, small dots in margins marking inconsistencies. He frowned, turning one sheet, then another. Lady Hailwick took a step toward him. Those are meaningless transcriptions by an emotional girl. Do not touch him, the Duke said. She stopped again. Briggs looked up from the pages, uncertainty giving way to caution. Madame, there are alterations here. Same line, 2 inks, different figures. Lady Hailwick laughed too brightly. Because we corrected errors, naturally. Charlotte spoke before anger could thicken her voice. Constable, page 42 of the Ledger English column, warehouse fee marked, unpaid in June. Swedish column on the facing page, same fee marked, paid in March with receipt number. The receipt number was later scraped and overwritten. You can see it if turned to the light. Briggs did exactly that, moving toward the hearth lamp for better angle. A thin roughness showed where ink had been lifted and reapplied. Even Arabella saw it and looked quickly away. Charlotte continued, still steady. Page 61 carries a guarantor notation under Ravensmere title. The numeral in the final sum was thickened after the signature dried. Compare the pressure, the tale of the 7 cuts through older ink. The Duke moved to Briggs's side. He took the ledger, turned pages with practised speed, and stopped where she had directed. His gaze fixed. The kitchen seemed to hold its breath with him. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "My brother's mark is here." No one answered. He touched the page once with the back of his knuckles, not smearing the ink. "The amount beneath it has been altered." Lady Halwick stepped forward, temper splitting polish at last. "That is absurd. Your Grace, surely you do not credit this girl over a lady of standing." He looked up. Winterwater eyes. Stone jaw. No room left in him for courtesy. "I credit the page." Arabella seized her mother's sleeve. "Mamma, we should go." Lady Halwick shook her off and advanced on Charlotte, hand lifting in a motion Charlotte knew too well. The motion that came before a public correction disguised as discipline. The Duke moved between them before the hand could fall. He did not touch Lady Halwick. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, immovable, broad back to Charlotte, and the room reorganized itself around that fact. "You will lower your hand," he said. Lady Halwick froze, then slowly let her arm fall to her side. Colour climbed her throat. "She provoked me. She testified to what is written." Charlotte's pulse hammered in her ears. She should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt a clean, hard sorrow, because no line in any ledger could return the years or unmake the kitchen scenes and attic winters. Truth would not be mercy. It would only be record. Constable Briggs straightened his coat and swallowed. "Given the dispute over account integrity and the possible forgery of guarantor sums, this requires magistrate review. All papers go under seal. No party alters, removes, or destroys from this moment." Lady Halwick wheeled on him. "You cannot seal my household books on the word of a dependent." Briggs set his jaw, finding courage in procedure. "I can when a duke's guarantor mark may have been falsified, madam." Silence answered him, thick and total. Charlotte felt Peter stir again. He had listened through all of it, eyes open, face tight. She turned back to him and adjusted the blanket up to his shoulder. "You did well," she said. His voice was rough. "I should have held the wheel chock better." "The wheel shattered at the hub," she replied. "Wood fails." "Men are not gods." At the edge of her vision she saw the Duke watching that exchange. Not her face this time, but her hands. The way she checked Peter's pulse, as naturally as breathing. The way she spent care where there was no advantage to gain. Lady Halwick gathered herself, collecting dignity like dropped fabric. "Very well, we shall attend the magistrate and end this nonsense before supper." She turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at Charlotte with cold precision. "If you have any instinct for self-preservation, you will remember who fed and housed you these 2 years." Charlotte met that stare without lowering hers. "I remember exactly." Lady Halwick left in a gust of wet lavender and offended silk, Arabella following close with frightened anger in her eyes. The yard noise surged briefly as carriage doors slammed and servants were ordered about. Then only rain remained, steady against stone. Constable Briggs wrapped the ledger and copied pages in fresh cloth, tied them with twine, and pressed his seal wax over the knot while the innkeeper witnessed. He noted each item aloud. Charlotte listened to every word, correcting one date when he misstated it, and he amended the line without protest. Evidence entered the world as record, not rumour. That mattered. When Briggs finished, he looked to Charlotte. "Miss Johansson, you may ride in my cart with the documents if you wish to remain near them." She could have accepted. It was safer to be beside the papers than away from them. Yet Peter needed one more check before transit, and the cart had no suspension for a set arm. She looked from the constable to the Duke and made the decision that cost her comfort and guarded someone weaker first. "Seal them now and keep them on your person," she said. I will ride with Mr. Peter in the Ravensmere carriage to keep the splint stable." Peter looked startled, then relieved enough that his eyes shone. The Duke's gaze held hers. There was recognition in it now, stripped of suspicion, not gratitude spoken in soft phrases. Something harder and rarer. Respect, perhaps. Witness, certainly. "Do it," he said to his staff at the door. "Prepare the carriage with blankets. Slow pace to the magistrate. No jolts." A groom ran. Charlotte picked up her ruined shoe and set it more firmly beneath her, testing the cut at her heel and accepting the pain as the price of standing. She lifted her carpet bag from the table and slung it over her shoulder, light now that the papers were gone, and therefore strangely heavier. The Duke spoke once more, quiet enough that only she heard. "You protected my man when your own position was under attack." She answered without ornament. "He was bleeding. The order of things was plain." His scarred hand flexed once at his side, then stilled. "It is plain to you, not to most." He stepped back and opened the kitchen door himself, rainlight spilling across the threshold like steel. Charlotte moved first to Peter's side, checked the sling one final time, and guided the grooms on where to place their hands for lifting. She did not look toward the yard gate, where Lady Halwick's carriage waited like accusation. She looked only at the path of stable stones ahead, counted steps, and walked beside the injured man all the way to the waiting coach. The grooms lifted Peter on Charlotte's count, one hand at shoulder, one at hip. A folded blanket braced beneath the splintered arm so the bone would not jar. Rain slapped the carriage roof in hard, flat beats. Mud sucked at boots. The Ravensmere coach stood dark and high-wheeled beside the mounting block, lamps already lit against the noon grey. Charlotte kept one palm lightly on Peter's wrist as they carried him, feeling his pulse skip and race, then settle when she said his name. "Look at me, Mr. Peter. Breathe slowly. You are nearly there." He tried to nod and winced. "I am sorry, miss." "You will spend your strength on staying awake." The groom, nearest his feet, glanced toward the Duke for permission to continue. The Duke gave a single movement of his chin. No wasted speech, no confusion about who decided. Charlotte expected to be told to follow in the constable's cart after she settled Peter. That would have been proper. That would have kept rank at a safe distance. She stepped back when they reached the carriage step, meaning to hand over and withdraw. The Duke blocked that retreat without touching her. "Inside!" "Your Grace, I can ride on the box. There is little room and—" "Inside!" The rain ran off his hair in narrow streams. His face looked carved from wet stone. He was not loud. He did not need to be. Behind him, through the curtain of weather, she could see Lady Halwick's carriage near the gate, violet silk visible at the half-open door as her stepmother argued with Constable Briggs over precedence and pace. Charlotte felt the old reflex rise. Make herself small, stay out of sight, avoid a fresh accusation of overreach. The Duke read the hesitation in her body and said, flat and final, "You keep his arm stable. You do not sit in rain while bleeding through your shoe." Heat struck her face despite the cold. He had seen that too. Of course he had. He offered his hand to place her into the carriage. She took it because refusing in the yard would have made a spectacle. His palm was calloused and rain-cold, grip exact, lifting her as if her weight were no burden. Peter was already stretched along the forward bench, jaw tight, eyes half closed. Charlotte climbed in beside him at once, bracing her knees to make space for the splint. The Duke entered after them, broad shoulders forcing the doorframe, and shut the coach door himself. The sounds sealed them into dimness and leather and rain. By the time they rolled out of the White Hart yard, the church bell had not yet struck the hour, but the road was already churned by too many wheels and too much water. The carriage lurched. Peter hissed through his teeth. Charlotte slid one hand under his elbow support and one at his wrist to keep the arm from knocking the panel. "That is it," she murmured. "Do not lock your jaw. Let it pass through." Across from her, the Duke planted his boots wide against the floor and did not move, absorbing each jolt through his own frame. Water dripped from his coat hem onto the matting. A thin line of blood had dried at the cuff where his sleeve was torn, but he gave it no attention. After a minute, he rapped once on the roof with his cane handle. "Slower!" The coachman called back, through rain, "Road is deep, Your Grace. Slower!" The pace changed at once. Peter's breathing eased. Charlotte adjusted the folded blanket and checked his fingers again for warmth. Still pink, still responsive. She let herself breathe once, carefully, and became aware of other pain returning now that urgency had slackened. Her heel throbbed in rhythm with the wheels. Her torn chemise edge chilled against skin. Her stomach cramped on emptiness. She shifted to hide the foot that was bleeding, tucking the damaged shoe beneath the opposite hem. "You will take that off," the Duke said. She looked up sharply. "What?" "Your shoe. It is nothing." "It is leaving blood on my carriage floor." The words were blunt. The tone was not contempt. It was the same ledger precision with which he had named every visible fact she tried to conceal. She kept her voice low, so Peter would not hear the strain. "My concern is his arm, and mine is both of you, shoe." Charlotte stared at him, anger and humiliation rising together because command had been the instrument of her daily degradation for 2 years, and her body recognized it before her mind could separate this order from those. He watched the reaction pass over her face, and his jaw tightened once, scar at his knuckle whitening where he gripped the cane. Then he set the cane aside and spoke more quietly. "Miss Johansson, if the cut deepens, you will not stand in that chamber when it matters. Remove it." The chamber, the magistrate, testimony. He was not speaking of comfort, he was speaking of function. She bent and unlaced the ruined shoe with stiff fingers. Stocking wool peeled from the wound in a sting that made her breath catch. Blood had spread in a crescent at the heel, not severe but open again from the yardstones. She unwound the petticoat strip she had tied on the road that morning and saw it soaked through. The Duke reached to the side compartment, drew out a folded square of clean linen, and held it toward her. "Use this." She hesitated. "It is too fine for a heel." His eyes met hers. "I decide what my linen is for." Charlotte took it. The cloth was better than anything she had touched in months. Close woven, smelling faintly of starch and cedar. She folded it down and pressed it to the cut. Pain flashed clean and bright, then dulled. The carriage rocked over a rut. Peter groaned and tried to rise. "Stay down," Charlotte said at once, hand firm on his shoulder. "You are safe." The Duke leaned forward before she could adjust the support alone. One large hand came beneath Peter's splintered forearm, not clumsy, not tentative. He held the weight exactly where she indicated with a glance. His sleeve pulled back enough for Charlotte to see the fresh cut at his own wrist, shallow and still seeping, where glass or metal had caught him at the wheel brake. "You are bleeding," she said. He did not look at his arm. "Later." "Now," she answered, the word out before caution could soften it. "If you leave it wet and dirty, it will inflame." For a beat, she expected rebuke. He was a duke. She was a displaced daughter with mud on her hem, and no legal place in his carriage. Instead, he held her gaze, then gave one short nod. "Do it quickly." She tore a narrow strip from what remained of her chemise edge, rinsed it with a splash from the water flask, and wrapped his wrist with economical turns while he kept Peter's arm steady. His skin was cold, Old scars crossed the back of his hand in pale lines, some narrow as threads, one broad near the thumb joint where flesh had healed unevenly. A soldier's hand, though she did not know his war. He did not flinch when she tied the knot. He did not thank her. The lack of ceremony felt, in that moment, like trust. Rain hammered harder. Outside, another carriage drew close, wheels grinding in parallel. Through the fogged glass she saw the blurred outline of Lady Halwick's crest, and a flash of Arabella's pale face at the window turned toward Ravensmere's coach with naked fury. Charlotte lowered her voice. "She will attempt to separate me from the papers before we enter." "She will attempt many things," he said, "and if she succeeds, she will not." The certainty in those 3 words reached deeper than reassurance would have. Reassurance could fail. Certainty had to be enforced. Peter stirred again, pupils unfocused. "Your Grace," he whispered, panic cutting through pain. "I dropped the brace pin. I did not check it twice. Dismiss me if you must. Only do not send word to my mother before I can—" "Stop," the Duke said. Peter fell silent at once, breath shuddering. "You are hurt, not dismissed. You held the team long enough to keep the coach from overturning. You did your duty." Peter blinked, as if he had misheard. The Duke did not repeat himself. He kept his hand under the splint and looked instead at Charlotte. "He listens to you. Keep him awake." She asked Peter his village, his mother's Christian name, the month he entered service. Small questions to keep his mind tethered. He answered in fragments. Each time his eyes drifted closed, she touched his sleeve and called him back. Opposite her, the Duke remained absolutely still, except for the minute adjustments of his hand every time the carriage swayed. A man accustomed to issuing orders had chosen instead to hold weight in silence, because movement would cost the injured more than stillness. She saw the effort in the muscle at his jaw. She did not look away. At the toll bridge before town, the coach slowed to a halt. Voices rose outside. The keeper demanded sequence of entry. Lady Halwick's footman shouted precedence for her carriage. The constable shouted back about sealed evidence in transit. The Duke struck the roof once. A groom opened the door a hand's width against rain. "Your Grace!" The Duke removed a signet ring from his gloved hand and passed it out without ceremony. "Take this to the bridge keeper. This coach crosses first. Then the constable's cart. Halewick carriage waits." The groom hesitated. "Lady Halewick is refusing, sir." "Then she may refuse from behind us." "Yes, your Grace." The door shut. Charlotte watched him replace the glove over the bare finger. The absence of the ring looked startlingly intimate, a mark of power set aside for function as bluntly as the linen had been set aside for her heel. "You did not need to do that," she said. "I did." "You risk open insult to a lady of rank." His mouth hardened. "She raised her hand to you in a public kitchen." The statement landed between them, heavier than the carriage air. He continued, each word measured. "I saw the bruises at your wrists before she entered. I saw you flinch when she lifted that hand. I saw you lie about both." Charlotte felt the old defence leap to her tongue. Trunk latch, clumsy stairs, careless grip on coal scuttle. She swallowed all of it. He had already rejected those fictions in the kitchen with one quiet word. Rain blurred the glass to silver. The bridge chain clanked free. Wheels started again. The Duke spoke without looking away from her face. "Hear me carefully, Miss Johansson. From this moment, no one questions you without me present. No one touches you without consequence. If any person in that chamber calls you unstable, disloyal, or thief, I answer first." Her breath stopped. The offer was too large to fit inside the life she had been living. It was also not an offer at all. It was declaration, protection named in the grammar of command. She found her voice with effort. "Why?" He did not answer at once. The carriage passed off the bridge onto stone, smoother now, the rhythm changing under their feet. Peter drifted, then jerked awake at Charlotte's prompt and resumed reciting months under his breath. At last the Duke said, "Because you walked into rain with one bag and still chose the injured over yourself. Because you guarded evidence when it would have been safer to burn it. Because you told the constable to witness process while your own blood was in your shoe." He paused. The scar at his knuckle pulled white again. "And because I knew your father." Charlotte stared. "You knew Captain Johansen." "I knew his accounts. I knew his word." His gaze sharpened. "When your surname reached my door 3 winters ago, I sent letters. No reply came. I sent again. No reply." The carriage seemed to narrow around her. "Lady Hailwick controlled all correspondence after his death. I know that now." Now, too late for her father, not too late for this hour. He leaned forward a fraction, voice lower. "I should have come sooner." The confession was stripped to bone. No explanation attached, no request for absolution. A fact offered like a wound uncovered. Charlotte did not know what answer belonged to such a sentence. Anger rose, then faltered against the sight of him still bracing Peter's arm with his own injured hand, rainwater drying in dark marks on his coat, while he sat in rigid vigilance beside a servant and a woman of no present standing. Outside, townstone replaced open road. Hoofbeats changed pitch. The magistrate's building came into view through the rain, square and severe, steps crowded with clerks, constables, and those who fed on public disputes as if they were theatre. Ravensmere's carriage did not pause at the lower yard where ordinary parties waited. It rolled straight to the side entrance under the eaves. Before the wheels stopped, the Duke gave his final instruction. "You will walk at my left. You will not lower your eyes for her. Stay beside me." He opened the door himself and stepped down into rain, then turned and held up his hand for Charlotte as the magistrate's clerk hurried toward them with a sealed docket, and Lady Halwick's voice carried from the main steps, sharp with outrage, demanding to be admitted first. Charlotte placed her hand in his and stepped down into rain that smelled of iron and wet stone, then matched his stride beneath the eaves while Clark stared openly at the mud on her hem and the blood-dark patch at her heel. The side door opened onto a narrow corridor lined with legal notices and dripping greatcoats. Constable Briggs met them there with the sealed bundle against his chest, and relief plain on his face when he saw the Duke at Charlotte's side. "This way," he said. "Magistrate Ellery is already seated." Lady Halwick's voice carried from the main hall, sharp and outraged, demanding precedence by rank. Arabella answered in a lower rush. Minerva had arrived as well, rustling and breathless, her pale gloves spotted with rain where she had gripped the carriage rail too hard. None of them looked at Charlotte as they were ushered in. They looked at the Duke. The chamber was close and over-warm, with damp wool steaming and candle smoke trapped under a low plaster ceiling. Magistrate Ellery sat behind a scarred desk with 2 clerks at either side, both already writing. A guard closed the door. The bolt slid. The sound settled in Charlotte's bones. Peter was not in the room. For one terrible moment she thought he had been removed without care. Then she saw a Ravensmere valet at the back, holding Peter's cap, and learned from one glance, at the man's steady posture, that the boy had been taken directly to a surgeon as ordered. One thread eased. "Proceed," Ellery said. Constable Briggs stepped forward first. He stated time, place, complaint, seizure of documents, and the names of witnesses present at opening. The innkeeper from the White Hart confirmed each point in a flat voice that admitted no embellishment. She did not add sympathy. She did not withdraw a single fact. The clerks wrote quickly. When Charlotte was called, she stood with her hands loose at her sides so no one could call her theatrical. Her stomach was still empty. Her heel still burned. Her voice came out clear. She explained the ledger entries line by line. She explained the dual language columns and where alterations had been made after signatures dried. She explained how she had copied discrepancies through winter and stored the copies in oilcloth. She named dates without looking down. She did not mention hunger. She did not mention the attic room. She gave the court numbers, pressure marks, ink shifts, sequence. Lady Halwick laughed once, high and brittle. She learned figures from sailors. Is this to outweigh a lady's account? Charlotte did not turn toward her. A sum is either true or false, madam. It does not improve by silk. The clerk's mouth twitched and went still again. Ellery held out his hand for the ledger. The constable broke seal in view of all parties and passed it over. The magistrate checked the page 42 discrepancy himself by turning the paper toward a lamp. He checked page 61 with Ravensmere's guarantor mark. His brows drew in, then hardened. Your Grace, he said, do you recognise this signature? I do, the Duke answered. It is my late brother's hand. The amount beneath was altered. Lady Halwick shifted at last from confidence to calculation. If there is error, it is clerical. My stewards may have corrected old shipping confusion. Captain Johansen's books were notoriously disorderly. They were not, Charlotte said before she could stop herself. He kept cleaner accounts than half this county. Ellery glanced up at her, then at the Duke. The Duke said, Captain Johansen's books were exact. The magistrate nodded once. Noted. He turned pages in silence for nearly a minute. Rain tapped at the window panes. A clerk sanded wet ink. Minerva's rings clicked against each other where her fingers shook in her lap. Then Ellery said, Miss Johansen, you stated there was an eviction notice. Charlotte reached into the inner seam of her carpet bag, where she had stitched the pocket herself, and withdrew the half-burned paper. Her fingertips brushed char at the edge. She placed it on the desk. Ellery unfolded it with care. The top edge was blackened. The body text remained legible. One night, by morning you are off my property, he read aloud. Signed by Lady Halwick, witnessed by Arabella Halwick. Arabella jerked as if struck. I signed what Mamma placed before me. I did not read it. You witnessed a forced expulsion in writing, Ellery said. Did you deny Miss Johansen food or shelter that night? Arabella looked at her mother, then at the Duke, then at the blotter on the desk. Breakfast was not set for her, she whispered. Lady Halwick snapped. Do not be foolish. Minerva spoke for the first time, voice thin. The key to the library was always at Mamma's waist. Charlotte was forbidden entry. There it was, the loaded silence from years of corridors, finally broken only because authority had changed direction. Lady Halwick stood abruptly, silk hissing. This is coercion. My daughters are frightened. They are answering, Ellery said. Sit down. She remained standing. The guard moved one pace closer. She sat. By the time the court clock struck 4, the chamber air had gone stale and thick, and Charlotte's legs trembled from holding still. But every item she had carried into Rain now existed as record. The ledger, the copies, the expulsion notice, witness signatures, guarantor mark, alteration points, seizure chain. Nothing remained rumour. Ellery set down his pen. Findings as follows. The debt instrument used to justify Miss Johansen's expulsion is fraudulent and void in full. The attempted transfer of Johansen property under that instrument is unlawful and reversed. Lady Halwick is committed under guard on charges of fraud, forgery, and assaultive conduct witnessed this day. Constable Briggs, remove her from management of Halwick accounts immediately, seal the household ledgers, and transfer control to court-appointed stewards by morning. The court further orders restitution. Sums and proceeds taken under the false debt are to be repaid from controlled Halwick accounts to the Johansen estate, with immediate disbursement entered today and the balance scheduled under Clark's supervision. Lady Hailwick half rose again. "You cannot remove me from my own house." Ellery's voice did not rise. "The fraudulent claim is struck. Your control is ended by order of this court. Sit." She did not sit quickly enough. The guard's hand touched her elbow. "Not rough. Final." The magistrate turned to Charlotte. "Miss Johansen, as Captain Johansen's surviving child, you are restored full legal standing over Johansen effects and household property unlawfully withheld. You will receive escorted access this evening for inventory, keys, and possession under writ." Charlotte heard the words and felt nothing for a second, then too much, all at once. Restored standing, escorted access, personal effects, her father's books, her mother's chest, rooms not locked by another woman's ribbon. Ellery added, "You also filed no complaint regarding your own injuries." Charlotte answered, "I request the record include physical intimidation and deprivation. I do not request spectacle." "It will be included." He signed. Wax was melted. Seals were pressed. The clerk read dispositions aloud. Fraud entered. Control removed. Restitution ordered. Standing restored. Every thread tightened, closed. At the door, as Lady Halwick was led out, she turned once, with a face gone hard and colourless. "You think this saves you?" Charlotte met her gaze, calm now, because the ledger had spoken where pleading never had. "No, it ends you." Lady Hailwick gave no reply. She was taken into the corridor. Arabella followed in tears. She wiped at once. Minerva did not cry. She looked at Charlotte as if seeing someone she had been trained not to see, then lowered her eyes and left without a word. The young gentleman who had watched in the drawing-room months before stood in the rear gallery today, and when Charlotte looked toward him, he looked away again. He never spoke at all. A groom entered, damp and breathless, and returned the Duke's signet ring on an open palm. "Bridge-keeper sent his apologies, Your Grace." The Duke took the ring and slid it back onto his finger, without comment. Constable Briggs approached Charlotte with her sealed items now resealed and endorsed. "All submitted, copies retained by court clerk, originals logged for audit. This is your receipt." He handed her a folded docket with neat script and official stamp. "If anyone challenges possession, show this." "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Outside the chamber, in the narrower clerk's passage, the Ravensmere valet bowed. "Miss Johansen, Mr. Peter is stable. Surgeon confirms clean set. He asks me to tell you he can move his fingers and was a fool for apologising." Charlotte let out a breath that had been lodged behind her ribs for hours. "Tell him he was not a fool." "I shall." Rain had thinned to mist by the time they stepped into the courtyard. Lanterns were being lit. The White Hart innkeeper passed on her way to the outer gate, gave Charlotte one brief nod, and was gone back to her own labour, her part done. The Duke stood beside Charlotte under the stone arch while clerks hurried around them with bundles and seals. He did not crowd her. He did not soften his posture. He simply remained. "There is one matter left," he said. She turned toward him, tired enough that defences slipped and only plainness remained. "What matter?" "You have legal standing and no safe house for tonight." "I can take a room in town." "You will not." His gaze held hers. "Ravensmere Hall has rooms, staff, and records that concern this case. You are needed there for stewardship. You are also entitled to protection that does not expire at dawn." She felt the old reflex to decline charity rise and fail, because this was not charity spoken in sweet terms. It was structure, place, work, dignity with locks that answered to her. He continued, voice lower. I asked in the carriage why I did not come sooner. I will not repeat that failure. Come to Ravensmere. Stay as long as you wish. Charlotte looked at his scarred knuckles, at the ring restored to his hand, at the strict stillness that cost him effort each time concern crossed into speech. She thought of the attic wind, the locked library door, the pump handle biting her palms, the road, the mud, the yard full of strangers, and the one command in the rain that had become shelter in law. As what? She asked. He answered without hesitation. As my wife, if you consent, as mistress of your own rooms and partner in estate accounts. The marriage will be honourable, no claim beyond what you freely grant. If you decline marriage, you may still take Ravensmere protection and independent quarters under contract. Choose. The crux of her life narrowed to that single offered choice, and what moved her was not rank, but that he gave her one at all. She said, I will not be owned. No, I will not surrender my father's name in my work. Keep it in every ledger. I will restore his library at Halwick. You will have men and wagons by morning. She held his gaze one heartbeat longer. Then I will stay. Not for a week, not until scandal cooled, not under threat. By will. He inclined his head once, as if accepting terms in a treaty. Good. They went directly to the licence office while mist silvered the street stones. The clerk there looked from mud-stained hem to ducal seal, startled, then efficient. Names were entered. Conditions were spoken plainly. Charlotte signed with a steady hand. Alistair Thorne signed beneath her. The clerk stamped the register and handed over the certificate, drying wax with a practised wave. When they stepped back into the evening, Ravensmere's carriage waited with fresh blankets and a clean bandage roll laid ready on the seat. Charlotte climbed in with her carpet bag and court receipt and the small volume of Cowper still tucked inside. The Duke followed, shut the door, and gave one order through the panel. Home! The coach rolled toward Ravensmere Hall, and before the lamps of town had disappeared behind them, he drew a key from his coat pocket and placed it in Charlotte's open hand. For the West Library, he said. Keep it.